Chapter 31 Iron Will, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As a main battle tank tasked with both anti-armor missions and direct fire support, the T-34 naturally carried high-explosive shells as part of its standard load. The EV-350M He fragmentation shell had a full 76 mm diameter, and its warhead contained 620 grams of TNT, fired from the T-34's F-34 76 mm gun. It reached a muzzle velocity of 680 meters per second, far surpassing the 420 meters per second muzzle velocity of the He shells fired by the German Panzer IV, which was the Wehrmacht's main tank at the time. Against lightly armored or unarmored anti-tank guns with exposed crews, He shells with their devastating surface effect were the perfect choice for Malyshenko. Although he'd only had some basic loader training and was short on experience, Kirill did his best after receiving Malyshenko's order. Working in the cramped turret of the T-34, he bent over, grabbed a clearly marked He shell from the ammo rack at his feet, and hefted it into his arms. Ding ding, click, the sharp metallic sound of the breech opening echoed in the tight turret. Kirill, hunched over and holding the 76 mm He shell, shoved it into the chamber. Loaded, Chi-La, the T-34, with Seryosha at the wheel, screeched to a halt, throwing up dirt and mud in a near drift. Sayonara, Krauts, the instant the tank stopped shaking, he stomped the firing pedal. The firing pin struck the primer of the 76 mm He shell, propelled by burning propellant. The shell roared down the barrel towards the German position at 680 meters per second, boom. In less than a second, the round found its mark. The impact fuse, sensitive to only 1 mm of penetration, detonated the warhead the moment it struck the barrel of a PAK-38 anti-tank gun. The explosion ripped through the area, sending deadly shrapnel flying, cutting down everything in its path. The PAK-38's 5 mm gun shield was only effective against small arms fire. Against the T-34's of 350M, it was useless. The four-man German anti-tank gun crew, including the gunner who was using binoculars to spot and correct targets, was instantly torn apart by the blast. Malyshenko kept the gun sight trained on the German position. Through the flames and smoke, he even saw a bloody head, helmeted, flying into the air. A cold smile on his lips, he pulled his eye from the sight. First one down. Keep it up, guys. Knowing this was just the beginning, Malyshenko kicked Seryosha in the back. Seryosha knew exactly what that meant. He slammed the gearshift lever forward. Early T-34s lacked radios for inter-vehicle communication. Unlike Allied and German tankers, the crew couldn't use throat mics and headsets. They could shout to communicate during marches, but the noise of battle, the explosions, and the roar of the T-34's diesel engine made it impossible to hear each other in combat. The Soviets, lacking the technology to fix the problem, came up with a more direct solution. Their feet. If the commander wanted the driver to stop and stabilize the gun, he'd kick him in the back. To turn left, he'd kick the driver's left shoulder. To turn right, the right shoulder. This was how the Soviet T-34 tank commander and driver, sitting one behind the other, effectively communicated in battle. It sounds crude, but it worked. That was the typical Soviet way, and there's a reason why T-34 drivers were known as strongmen. To minimize the tank's profile and reduce its chances of being hit, Soviet engineers boldly relocated the transmission from the front to the engine compartment in the rear. This eliminated the long drive shaft used to transmit power from the engine to the front transmission, saving space and reducing the tank's height. However, this design wasn't perfect. With the transmission located in the rear, the driver had to operate it via a series of cables running the length of the tank. Without power steering or other assistance, shifting gears was incredibly difficult, relying solely on mechanical force and friction. Even with a strong Soviet driver, the stiff, mechanical joystick often left him sweating and exhausted. Chapter 32 Iron Will, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Everything went as Malyshenko expected. After the first German anti-tank gun targeting Malyshenko's vehicle was knocked out, the German defensive position erupted in a blaze of light and deafening noise. Chichi, chichi, star, the sound ripped through the air like a chainsaw tearing through timber. Bright green German tracers streamed out, impacting like a wall of water. The front of the vehicle rattled like it was being swarmed by mosquitoes. Before Ko could swing the turret, a horrifying shriek pierced Malyshenko's mind, the sound of bullets ripping through flesh. "We've got a problem. Well, let's just say there's extra armor hanging off the turret. This won't do. They'll be sitting ducks out there. We need to get these guys off the tank, pronto." A bad feeling washed over him. He shoved the heavy turret hatch open and cautiously poked his head out. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold, half an arm dangling from the turret. Damn it, blood and guts everywhere. These Soviet grunts really get the short end of the stick. He flicked the gruesome piece of debris off the turret and turned to see an infantry company commander huddled behind the engine compartment, clutching his Mosin-Nagant rifle. Since the Soviets lacked dedicated armored personnel carriers like the German Tu-51 series, Soviet infantry had no choice but to cling to the outside of tanks during coordinated assaults, a desperate and dangerous tactic. While this increased speed, it came at a horrific cost. Flying shrapnel and machine gun fire could, and often did, tear these unprotected soldiers from the tanks, sending them to their deaths. There are no accurate figures for the number of human flesh armor casualties during the war. But one thing remains clear: this crude method of advancing alongside tanks was a major factor in the consistently high casualties suffered by the Soviet Red Army throughout the Great Patriotic War. He couldn't change the overall situation and shouldn't even be concerning himself with such high-level problems. Malyshenko, leading the division's spearhead, needed to focus on one thing: getting to the German lines and keeping the accompanying infantry alive as long as possible. He frowned, looking at the terrified lieutenant cowering behind the turret. What was going on in this guy's head? He bellowed. "Lieutenant! Get your men off the tank now. They're sitting ducks out here. They need to advance behind the tank." In stark contrast to Malyshenko's forceful command, the lieutenant, clearly shaken by the MG-34 fire, lacked the decisiveness expected of an officer. "Comrade Captain, my orders from battalion are to stick to your tank and charge. My military training tells me I can't change a superior's orders. We're supposed to stay mounted until we're within 100 meters of the German position." 100 meters? Hell, at 100 meters, they'll all be mowed down. Malyshenko, a time traveler, knew that the officers rushed through training after the purges were often of questionable quality and rigidly dogmatic. Some were even worthless sycophants. Still, he was shocked by the level of blind adherence to doctrine displayed by this new breed of officer, anger mixed with disappointment. This lieutenant, probably Kirill's age, was clearly unreliable. Malyshenko made a snap decision: he couldn't count on him. "Kirill, tell Seriosha to stop. We have to dismount the infantry. At this rate, they'll all be dead before we reach the German lines." "Understood, Comrade Captain." Kirill, the loader, tapped the driver, Seriosha, to stop. The other T-34s, closely monitoring the situation, followed suit. The surviving Red Army soldiers, having suffered heavy casualties from the machine gun fire, finally got a reprieve. They scrambled off the tanks, instinctively seeking cover behind the vehicle's hull. Seeing this, Malyshenko glanced at the lieutenant, who had immediately scurried behind the tank. Knowing it was too dangerous to stay exposed, Malyshenko slammed the hatch shut and returned to his position in the turret. Seeing the Soviet infantry dismounting from the tanks, the puzzled No. 3A assault gun gunner, Klink, turned to his commander. "Michel, we're close enough, aren't you going to let me fire?" Chapter 33 Soldier, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Compared to the trigger-happy gunner Klink, Whitman, considered one of history's top armored aces, was calm and collected, like a seasoned hunter. "What's the rush, Klink? Relax. If you open fire now, those Ivans will zero in on us. We're just an ambush team, not here to take on Ivan's whole army. Wait for the perfect moment." Klink, hearing Whitman's orders, reluctantly returned to his gun sight, focusing on his duty. Meanwhile, on the main battlefield, Malyshenko, unaware of the German assault gun squad lurking less than 300 meters away, directed the battle after deploying the infantry. "Slow and steady in first gear, Seriosha. Everyone stay sharp. The Germans have more than one anti-tank gun out there. That last shot was probably just a test. Boom, boom, boom. Before Malyshenko could finish his orders, another barrage of anti-tank fire erupted from the German position. Malyshenko was right, the initial shot was just a test. The German frontline units hadn't had time to fully analyze the captured Soviet T-34 tanks, lacking a weakness analysis atlas. They didn't know the T-34's weak points or the ideal range for a guaranteed kill. Facing the advancing T-34s, the Germans were forced to improvise, firing blindly to gauge their effectiveness. The results were disheartening. Previous encounters had demonstrated the PAK-36-37mm anti-tank guns' complete ineffectiveness against the T-34, even at point-blank range. At best, it was a minor annoyance. Therefore, the Adolf Hitler Guards Division was equipped with the advanced PAK-38 anti-tank guns. Yet even these guns failed at close range. The Type 39 armor-piercing projectiles from the PAK-38s hit their targets, the shell caps fragmented as intended upon impact with the T-34's armor, but even with everything working as planned, the shells failed to penetrate the T-34's main armor, often ricocheting harmlessly away. The German gun crews were in disbelief, watching through their binoculars as volley after volley proved useless. This is bull. I didn't sign up to tickle Soviet tanks. What's the point of these things? They should drag the idiots who invented these guns out here to look at the dents they're making. Despite his outburst, he reloaded and aimed, ready for another shot. But before the Germans could fire again, the T-34s, now within firing range, launched a counterattack. Boom, 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 boom. High-explosive shells from the T-34's main guns rained down on the German position, bringing death and destruction. Despite the effort to dig protective bunkers and minimize the gun's profile, the Soviet 76mm guns were devastating. The explosions ripped through the area, scattering shrapnel like a meat grinder. Anti-tank guns were twisted into scrap metal, and the position became a scene of carnage. The T-34s had wiped out at least 4 German anti-tank gun crews in a single volley. Even for the Adolf Hitler Guards Division, 5 anti-tank gun teams lost in the opening minutes was a devastating blow. Malyshenko, scanning the battlefield through his scope, felt uneasy despite having personally taken out 2 PAK-38s. He had yet to spot a single German Flak 36/3788mm anti-aircraft gun. While it was understandable that the small German raiding party wouldn't carry such a heavy weapon, Malyshenko couldn't believe the Germans wouldn't deploy the anti-everything 88mm in a defensive battle like this. Chapter 34 Soldier, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A tightly wound Malyshenko scanned the field with his wide-angle periscope, hunting for those deadly German 88mm anti-aircraft guns. He wanted to take them out before they could cause any trouble, but maybe the Germans were just too good at hiding them. Or, maybe they hadn't even bothered deploying the 88s on their first line of defense. Either way, after several sweeps of the German position, Malyshenko came up empty. The image of those thick barrels and tall gun mounts was burned into his memory, but there was no sign of them. He couldn't believe the Germans wouldn't use the 88s, which made the situation even worse. Boom. He slammed his fist against the cold gun breech, teeth clenched. This kind of battlefield, where the enemy was hidden and his own forces were exposed, was every commander's nightmare. Damn it! These Germans are just poking at us with those puny 50mm guns. What are they up to? Just as Malyshenko was racking his brain, a welcome sight appeared, more than a dozen T-34s leading the charge, with infantry riding alongside. Behind them, lumbering but surprisingly nimble despite their 52-ton weight, came 4 KV-2 heavy tanks. They finally caught up, facing the PAK-38 50mm anti-tank guns, which were still uselessly pinging off the T-34s from less than 300 yards away. These towering KV-2s ground to a halt. Their massive turrets began to rotate under the guidance of the steering mechanism. Through his scope, Malyshenko saw the new Soviet behemoths training their massive, unfamiliar guns on the German positions. One German gunner, directing his crew to keep firing at the T-34s, couldn't help but tremble. Jesus, what the hell is that? Boom! Before he could finish the sentence, the roar of a 152mm M10 howitzer firing drowned out everything else. Sand and debris exploded into the air as the 4 KV-2s fired almost simultaneously. For 152mm high-explosive shells, each weighing nearly 90 pounds and traveling at over 1,700 feet per second, slammed into the German position. Each shell was packed with almost 18 pounds of TNT. The resulting explosion was earth-shattering. The German anti-tank gun crews, who had been stubbornly holding their ground, were wiped out in an instant. The 152mm shells, designed to obliterate light fortifications, were overkill against anti-tank guns. Deafening blasts and fireballs engulfed the entire area, vaporizing the German gun crews. Where the German 50mm guns had stood, guns that could barely scratch a T-34, were now just 4 massive craters, big enough for infantry to use as foxholes. Nothing remained, neither man nor machine. The KV-2's 152mm cannon was devastatingly effective, but it came at a price. To accommodate this monstrous weapon, essentially a towed howitzer adapted for tank use, the KV-2 had a huge, boxy turret that looked like an outhouse. Inside, it took a 4-man crew to operate it, a gunner, commander, and 2 loaders. Yes, 2 loaders were needed just to feed the 152mm gun. Even with 2 strong loaders, the process was incredibly slow. After firing, the main loader had to open the breech, remove the separate projectile from the first ammunition rack in the rear of the turret, and place it on the ammunition belt. Then, the secondary loader would place the propellant charge onto the belt immediately after the warhead. The main loader, having just placed the warhead, would grab the ejector rod and manually ram the projectile and propellant into the chamber. After closing the breech, he would finally notify the gunner that the gun was ready to fire. In combat, this cumbersome, manual loading process, with shells weighing over 90 pounds, drastically reduced the KV-2's rate of fire. A skilled T-34 crew could reload in about 6 seconds. Even with 2 loaders, the KV-2 took about 30 seconds, in the best-case scenario, without any complications. As the battle wore on, fatigue set in, or teamwork suffered. The KV-2's reload time increased. In some particularly brutal engagements, it took 2 exhausted loaders a full minute to reload. As the 4 behemoths began their long reload, the German position, now a smoking mess, suddenly stirred. Through his scope, Malyshenko could hear the German commander say, rather unexpectedly, "Inform Schmeisser and the others that Ivan's giants are tired. It's their turn." Chapter 35. One man is in charge. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The German army had already learned firsthand just how powerful the Soviet KV-2 heavy tank was. They first encountered this behemoth during the early days of their offensive. The Battle of Ruzhny, a few days prior, saw the German 6th Panzer Division and the Soviet 2nd Tank Division clash in an epic, one-sided tank battle near the Dubisa River bridgehead. After a series of counterattacks, the Soviet 2nd Tank Division was forced to temporarily retreat due to dwindling ammunition and fuel. A lone KV-2 heavy tank became separated from the main force, finding itself stranded between 2 German-held bridgeheads. Fueled by unwavering resolve, the crew decided against abandoning their vehicle. Instead, they chose to fight a desperate rearguard action, buying time for the larger Soviet force to withdraw. The German 6th Panzer Division, initially underestimating the KV-2 due to a lack of intelligence, quickly prepared to eliminate this roadblock. They launched an initial assault. After a brief exchange, the main German force, eager to maintain its advance, attempted to bypass the KV-2. This proved disastrous. The KV-2's 152mm cannon relentlessly shelled the bypassing troops, destroying over a dozen troop transport trucks and KFZ 251 half-tracks. Realizing this armored giant was far more formidable than they had anticipated, the Germans called for reinforcements. A German anti-tank gun battery, equipped with 6 50mm PAK-38 guns, stealthily advanced to within 500 meters and opened fire on the isolated KV-2, the PAK-38, the Wehrmacht's most potent anti-tank gun at the time, easily capable of destroying Soviet T-26 and BT series light tanks, merely scratched the KV-2's thick armor. The continuous barrage inflicted no damage. Enraged, the KV-2 crew rotated their turret and obliterated the German anti-tank guns with a single blast from its 152 mm howitzer. Undaunted, the Germans launched another wave of attacks, employing a variety of weapons, including Panzer 35, T.S., Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and even 75 mm infantry guns. For hours, they hammered away at the KV-2, achieving nothing. Their attacks couldn't even scratch the paint on the motionless behemoth. Frustrated and awestruck by the Soviet tank's resilience, the German commander decided to deploy his trump card, an 88 mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun. However, the 88 mm anti-aircraft gun of the time was less mobile than the later Tiger tank's 88 mm gun. Its massive mount and shield meant it couldn't be moved by hand. A tracked tractor was required to tow the gun into position before it could be deployed and fired. Aware of the 88 mm gun's size and vulnerability, the Germans cautiously positioned it 2,000 meters from the KV-2 to begin, while the 88 mm gun, designed for air defense, possessed exceptional accuracy and range, allowing it to hit the KV-2 with ease even at that distance. The 88 mm armor-piercing rounds lost significant velocity over the 2-kilometer flight. The reduced penetration power proved insufficient to pierce the KV-2's thick armor. The shots were ineffective. Determined, the Germans risked moving the 88 mm gun closer. They remounted it on a half-track tractor and began a covert advance towards a more suitable firing position, hoping to shorten the distance and finally destroy the terrifying steel monster, but luck wasn't on their side this time. By tracing the impact trajectories of the non-penetrating rounds, the KV-2 crew, under the direction of its alert commander, detected the German 88 mm gun tractor moving to a position less than 700 meters away. The gunner fired preemptively, obliterating the 88 mm gun before it could even be unlimbered. As night fell, the German army, delayed for an entire day by this Soviet armored behemoth, had no choice but to disengage and withdraw. Under cover of darkness, German engineers, still clueless as to the KV-2's armor thickness, crept close to the tank and planted a massive amount of TNT, enough to demolish a house, against the chassis and tracks, hoping to cripple the seemingly more vulnerable areas. But the resulting explosion brought only further disappointment. The KV-2's comprehensive design negated the typical weaknesses of other tanks. The TNT, powerful enough to destroy a 2-story building, only managed to blow off the KV-2's tracks. Infuriated by the explosion, the KV-2 crew opened fire with their machine guns on the German engineers who were waiting nearby to assess the damage. The terrified engineers retreated to their lines without a second glance. With its tracks destroyed, the KV-2 could no longer maneuver effectively. This presented an ideal opportunity for the Germans. While several Panzer 35 T light tanks drew the KV-2's fire from a distance, a German tractor circled around the immobile KV-2 and positioned another 88 mm gun on high ground behind it. This time, with a clear field of fire, the 88 mm gun finally proved its worth. Firing with a high rate of fire, launching a shell every 8 seconds, it pumped 6 rounds into the KV-2's rear, finally destroying the seemingly indestructible Soviet behemoth. The German engineers, ordered to confirm the kill and dispose of the wreckage, were still unnerved by the previous night's events. Fearing the KV-2 might not be completely destroyed, they stuffed M24 grenades into the penetration holes left by the 88 mm rounds. A few muffled explosions finally put an end to the KV-2's undefeated streak. Although the battle ended in a German victory, the KV-2's performance left a profound impression. A single KV-2 heavy tank had single-handedly held up an entire elite panzer division for 2 days. This was largely due to the inadequacy of the German army's early war tanks and anti-tank guns, rather than any failings in German combat effectiveness or command. However, after this encounter, the German frontline troops, deeply impressed by the KV-2's astonishing combat capability, no longer dared to underestimate this toilet-head monster. The appearance of a Soviet KV-2 heavy tank on the battlefield signaled that it was time for the Wehrmacht to bring out all the stops. Chapter 36 Soldier, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The Germans, having captured numerous KV-2 heavy tanks, were well aware of the 152 mm cannon's slow reload time. After the 4 massive KV-2s unleashed a barrage, the waiting German forces revealed their trump card, the flak 36 88mm anti-aircraft gun, contrary to some rumors. Using 88mm anti-aircraft guns with armor-piercing rounds against enemy tanks wasn't limited to the North African campaign. It started earlier, back during the Spanish Civil War. Hitler, wanting to bring Franco under the Axis powers, secretly sent elite German troops to support the dictator. At the time, the German army, equipped only with Panzer I and II light tanks, couldn't handle the T-26 light tanks the Soviets were secretly supplying to the Spanish opposition. Frustrated, the Germans turned their 88mm anti-aircraft guns on the T-26s, firing them horizontally. They destroyed several Soviet tanks with single shots, proving the 88's effectiveness against armor. This was the first documented instance of the 88mm gun being used as an anti-tank weapon. Later, during the Blitzkrieg in Europe, the German army faced the armored forces of the British and French coalition in France. Even with the relatively advanced Panzer IV tanks, the Germans found their tanks outmatched. The Matilda heavy tanks of the British Expeditionary Force and the B-1 heavy tanks of the French armored forces were considered heavily armored at the time, far exceeding the capabilities of German anti-tank weaponry. As the British and French iron monsters advanced, threatening to break the German lines, the 88mm guns stepped up again. The British and French armored forces retreated, leaving behind dozens of burning tank wrecks. The German commander who turned the tide in that battle was none other than Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, one of the most legendary German generals of World War II. He commanded the 7th Panzer Division. This encounter with the British and French heavy tanks deeply impressed Rommel with the 88mm gun's anti-tank power. After that battle, Rommel kept the 88mm gun as his anti-armor trump card, using it to create a graveyard of British tanks in North Africa, cementing its legend. Now, the German 88th Artillery Team, having waited patiently on the battlefield, received orders to show what they could do. All gun positions, listen up. Target those Soviet heavy tanks, concentrated fire. 2 guns per target group, load armor-piercing rounds. Move it. Under the command of Company Commander Schmeisser, the 88mm anti-aircraft guns, previously hidden under foliage, shed their camouflage and prepared to fire. The Germans knew the power of the KV-2s. The Führer Guards Division, having confirmed their advance via reconnaissance, was ready. The Soviet armored forces had a quality advantage, forcing the Germans to adapt. This included modifying some 88mm anti-aircraft guns specifically for anti-tank combat. These modified 88s looked different. They removed the large, boxy gun mantlet, and lowered the tall gun mount. These changes transformed the anti-aircraft gun into a semi-professional 88mm anti-tank gun. Although still requiring tractors to move, the reduced profile significantly improved concealment. Before Malyshenko's vanguard attacked, Dietrich, commander of the Führer Guard Flag Corps, knew he had to use his 88s carefully. After consideration, Dietrich made a tough decision. When the Soviet attack began, the German defenders would use smaller PAK-38 50mm anti-tank guns to slow down the T-34s. Once the KV-2s were close enough for effective frontal penetration, the concealed 88 crews would exploit the KV-2's slow reload time, destroying the armored behemoths in a single, decisive blow. This strategy ensured the 88s wouldn't be destroyed by the KV-2's 152mm cannon fire, and that the slow-reloading KV-2s would be unable to retaliate or escape the 88's effective range. This was Dietrich's plan, crafted by a veteran of World War I's armored forces, to address the current situation. Chapter 37 Who Will Win, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The gun barrels, hidden among the bushes and weeds, swung towards the approaching hand-cranked helicopters as they moved into battle. The deadly armored killers, concealed in the darkness, swiftly and efficiently eliminated targets under the command of the skilled gun crew. The gun muzzles pointed directly at their targets. Fire! Boom, boom, boom. The powerful flak 36 88mm anti-aircraft gun unleashed its fury, the deafening roar accompanied by a fiery muzzle blast that instantly drowned out the command to fire. The PZGR 88mm armor-piercing rounds, screaming through the air at 810 meters per second, took less than a second to slam into the main armor of the KV-2 heavy tanks less than 500 meters away. The short-range, combined with the KV-2's massive size, ensured that the 888mm guns, renowned for their accuracy, found their mark every time. The 88mm armor-piercing rounds could still punch through 125mm of vertical homogeneous steel armor at that distance, and even the seemingly invincible KV-2 couldn't withstand such brutal force. The 75mm thick homogeneous steel armor, designed for comprehensive defense on all sides, had proven effective against smaller German anti-tank guns, even achieving legendary status during the Battle of Roseniai. But against the German 88, the most sophisticated anti-armor weapon of its time, the KV-2, with its 52-ton combat weight, simply couldn't concentrate enough armor on its front to resist the devastating penetration. Disaster struck instantly. It was like a hot knife through butter. The KV-2S, helpless against the 88mm's armor-piercing power, suffered the same fate as many T-34s. The shells, packed with a TNT equivalent of 280 grams, pierced the main turret armor and detonated inside as designed. An 88mm round containing over half a kilogram of TNT exploding inside the cramped turret was far more destructive than a simple firecracker. The 152mm projectiles and propellant cartridges stored on the rear ammunition rack ignited in a flash. Fiery flames erupted from the cylindrical propellant barrels, engulfing the 152mm shells above. The shells, rapidly heating up, couldn't withstand the inferno. The 8 kilograms of TNT inside ignited, causing unimaginable devastation in seconds. The scene of over a dozen 152mm artillery shells exploding inside the tank was apocalyptic. The blast wave, mixed with flames, ripped through the turret, consuming the 4-man crew. The driver and machine gunner in the hull were spared the initial blast, but the inferno quickly reached them, leaving no chance of survival. With a thunderous roar, the KV-2's massive turret was blown sky-high, unable to contain the force of the exploding shells. The internal 152mm M10T howitzer was ejected by the blast, landing nearby. The charred turret, still smoldering, lay beside the hull. This horrific scene wasn't an isolated incident. Simultaneously, 3 other KV-2 tanks, unaware of the threat, were ambushed by the concealed German 88s. 2 were instantly destroyed in fiery explosions. A third was rendered combat ineffective by shell fragments, killing almost the entire crew. In those 10 short seconds, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Just moments before, they had been charging forward, maintaining continuous fire suppression on the German positions. Now, Malyshenko's lead element had walked into an ambush and lost their 4 most valuable KV-2 fire support tanks in the blink of an eye. These armored behemoths, loaded with dozens of 152mm artillery shells and propellant charges, unleashed incredible destructive power upon detonation. Not only were they obliterated, but the blast waves and firestorms scattered shrapnel and armor fragments like a deadly metal storm. The Soviet infantry, using the T-34s as mobile bunkers, had no idea these reliable tanks would become explosive death traps in an instant. The infantry caught in the blast waves from the exploding KV-2s were instantly swept away like rag dolls. Hot shrapnel and armor fragments ripped through their thin uniforms. The subsequent blast waves even shook the nearby T-34s, tossing them around like toys. Shit! We're ambushed. Malyshenko had a bad feeling the moment he heard the distinctive sound of the German 88, but the speed of the attack left him no time to react. The T-34 lurched forward from the shockwave of the exploding KV-2s. Malyshenko, peering through the gun sight, slammed his forehead against the metal. Damn it! Those German bastards! They're willing to use their own lives as bait. Ruthless sons of bitches. He wiped blood from his forehead, gritting his teeth. The dire situation was more painful than his physical injuries. Chapter 38 Who Will Win, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Captain, what do we do? The Germans are still firing. It's an ambush. Before he could finish, the German 88 artillery team swung its gun around and unleashed another barrage at Malyshenko's T-34 tanks. Having already destroyed 4 KV-2 heavy tanks, the German 88th Artillery Group didn't let up, determined to wipe out Malyshenko's lead vehicles. Armor-piercing rounds screamed past Malyshenko's ears. He clutched his wound, his sleeve already soaked crimson, and without a second thought, ignoring his own injury, he addressed his crew, his right eye bloodied but still seeing clearly. "We don't retreat. Seriosha, start the engine. Full speed ahead at those damn fascists. Even if we go down, they'll know they're standing on Soviet soil." Escape was pointless. A powerful 500 horsepower diesel engine couldn't outrun an 88mm round traveling at 810 meters per second. The T-34, big for a medium tank, was a sitting duck for the 88mm gun at under 500 meters. Any German gunner with a pulse could hit them. Malyshenko knew this. He'd rather go out in a blaze of glory than be picked off from behind. He'd take some Germans with him. This wasn't about loyalty to his motherland. It was about a dying man's final act of defiance. Meanwhile, on a hillside less than 300 meters to the left of Malyshenko's remaining tanks, Michel Whitman, who had been waiting with his men since the start of the battle, remained patient. Assault gunner Klink, eager for action, was getting antsy. "Hey, Michel. Look at those Ivans, they're getting slaughtered. If we don't move now, we'll be picking up their scraps. How about we add a few more white rings to the barrel?" "Give the order." Whitman, looking through his periscope, gave Klink a cold glare. He had a plan. "I'm not ordering an attack, Klink. Those T-34s are already finished by the 88s. We don't need to waste our time. See those Soviet troops rushing in? That's your stage. Big army? Great stage." Klink was confused. The narrow field of view of the gun sight kept him from noticing the follow-up Soviet troops kicking up dust in the distance, but the experienced Whitman had already spotted his prey. Back at the command post, Division Commander Cherniev and Political Commissar Petrov, observing the battle through binoculars, realized that Malyshenko's lead vehicles had stumbled into a carefully laid German trap. The Soviet tank divisions, lacking experience in large-scale armored operations and burdened by outdated tactics, were no match for the German armored divisions. Cherniev and Petrov, surprised by the German tactic, were momentarily paralyzed, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, but the troops were already committed. Malyshenko couldn't withdraw. Petrov didn't want the offensive to fail so miserably. Nor did he want his nephew to die. Turning to Cherniev, he spoke sharply. "Comrade Division Commander, we can't abandon Malyshenko and his men. Look at them, ambushed by the Germans, yet they keep fighting. That's Soviet spirit. We need to send in reinforcements to press the attack." Cherniev lowered his binoculars, thought for a moment, and then, recovering his courage, responded with the conviction of a Red Army commander. "You're right, Peter. It's time those German invaders felt the power of the Red Army. Tell the 1st and 2nd Tank Regiments to launch flanking attacks on the German lines according to the plan. And get the artillery ready to suppress those German anti-tank guns." Chapter 39 Hammer Sparks. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Just when Malyshenko was pinned down in front of the German lines, caught in a deadly crossfire with no way out, he figured this was it. Then, the air cracked with the roar of incoming artillery, a sound like a beat-up truck drowning out everything else. Suddenly, all hell broke loose. The fighting stopped dead as both Soviet and German soldiers, locked in a brutal struggle, froze in stunned silence. Boom. A 203mm high-explosive shell, courtesy of the Soviet 5th Army Group's artillery battalion attached to the 20th Tank Division, landed with a vengeance. Weighing in at 98 kilograms, its 17 kilograms of TNT packed a punch more than twice as powerful as the KV-2 heavy tank's own 152mm shells. The raw destructive power was enough to make anyone's blood run cold. The Soviet 5th Army's artillery battalion, armed with 12B for 203mm heavy howitzers, unleashed a full barrage of 12 rounds. In seconds, the German position vanished in a storm of earth and fire. The 88th Artillery Group, which had been furiously targeting Malyshenko's T-34s, was simply wiped off the map, as the earth-shattering blasts faded, leaving behind a thick haze of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The surviving German soldiers on the front line stared in disbelief. Before them lay craters big enough to stock with fish, twisted wreckage of 88s, and scattered body parts. The sheer audacity of the Soviet artillery, risking friendly fire to obliterate their own positions, was a shock. The first line of defense outside Broad was decimated, losing almost half its strength in an instant. The artillery barrage far exceeded the expectations of Dietrich, the Guards Division commander. Boom. The sound was like a fist slamming into a sandbag. Dietrich, who had left his office in town and was now at the forward observation post directing the battle, was livid. Those crazy Ivans. The Tsar's army pulled this crap on us back in the day. The Bolsheviks are just carrying on the proud tradition. He spat out the words, his grip tightening on his binoculars. After a few seconds without any more explosions, Dietrich made a quick decision. Alfred, what's the status of our air support? Where are they? His young adjutant, glued to his side, snapped open his folder and barked out the information. General, Colonel Fernando radioed in 3 minutes ago. He reports that his first ground attack aircraft group has taken off and is en route to our position. He signed off by saying no further communication is needed, as he's personally leading the attack. Leading the attack himself, Dietrich was taken aback. He had assumed his old friend would just send in some fresh-faced pilots. The fact that a full colonel from the Air Force wing was personally joining the fight was a pleasant surprise. Well, that's encouraging. Fernando leading the charge shows he's serious about backing us up. Send word to hold the line. Diesel is to use his reserves to plug the holes Ivan just blasted. We cannot let those Soviet tanks break through. Pull the missing 88s from the division's air defense battalion and reinforce the front immediately. Ivan's follow-up is coming, and it's going to be a real shitshow. The adjutant, scribbling furiously on a notepad, nearly dropped his pen. He thought he had misheard. He shook his head, double-checking he was fully awake, then dared to challenge Dietrich. But General, the headquarters air defense battalion is critical for your personal safety. If we pull the 88s to the front and Soviet planes show up, putting you at risk, well, heads will roll, all the way up to the top. The young adjutant, who had been with Dietrich for 3 years, wasn't wrong. Dietrich, a World War I vet who had risen through the ranks to become one of Hitler's closest confidants, was practically untouchable. As the head of the elite Guards Division, he was a symbol of the regime. The thought of Hitler's reaction if Dietrich were killed or wounded due to negligence sent a shiver down the adjutant's spine. It wasn't just concern for Dietrich's safety, it was also about self-preservation. Dietrich had anticipated the concerns of those around him. But he was resolute. I know what you're thinking, Alfred. But a general who can't defend his troops and his positions doesn't need guards. What good are they? Germany needs iron, blood, and unwavering resolve to rise from the ashes, not the cowardly junkers from the last war, who were too afraid to die. Do you understand me? Chapter 40 Death Vulture, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Like many generals who started as ordinary soldiers in World War I before rising to high ranks in the German army during World War II, Dietrich, a longtime follower of Hitler, wasn't exactly fond of the Junker nobles who dominated the German Wehrmacht officer corps. The Junker officer corps' decision to abandon Kaiser Wilhelm II during the last war, which they framed as self-preservation, struck Hitler, a mere soldier at the time, as the ultimate betrayal. This conviction stuck with Hitler, even after he rose from being a nobody to the leader of Germany. My relationship with the Junker officer corps is purely transactional. I offer them a chance to reclaim their lost glory and seek revenge, and in return, they pledge their loyalty and eliminate my enemies. But the moment I stumble, those treacherous cowards will abandon me, just as they abandoned the emperor. Dietrich, who also served as a soldier in the previous war, naturally gravitated towards the Führer's seemingly stubborn, yet insightful, view. This largely explains why Dietrich, a high-ranking general in the Waffen-SS, held the Wehrmacht's Junker aristocracy in such low regard. Upon hearing the order, the young adjutant snapped to attention, gave the SS salute and quickly left to carry it out. Dietrich secretly vowed that the Guard Standard Division under his command would outperform those aloof nobles. Let's see which proves stronger against the Soviets, your so-called glorious tradition or our unwavering loyalty and faith. that the town's 88mm anti-aircraft guns were loaded onto half-track trailers and quickly moved towards the German front lines via the town of Brod's relatively intact roads. SS soldiers, still reeling from the shockwaves of recent explosions in their trenches and foxholes, barely had time to grip their weapons when a tremor, like a herd of horses, shook the entire German frontline defense position, growing louder as it approached. "Everyone, prepare for battle. The Russian tanks are coming." Panic spread as someone shouted the warning. Peeking cautiously from the trenches, the SS soldiers saw a flood of Soviet tanks churning up dust and earth, bearing down on them with a cacophony of grinding metal and earth-shaking vibrations. "Damn it, those Russians are really coming on strong this time. That's at least 2 armored regiments. Get moving. Artillery crews, stand by for my orders. Load armor-piercing rounds, quick, quick, quick. Aim, aim, fire." In stark contrast to the panicked scene on the German side, Malyshenko, having just received heavy artillery support and reinforcements, was relieved. He immediately issued orders to his crew. "All right, guys, our comrades are here to back us up. Let's go. Let's keep hammering those damn invaders until they're nothing but scrap. Euro. Morale, though intangible, is a powerful force. Even the greatest military commanders acknowledge its impact. Whether high or low, its spread is swift and contagious, like wildfire or plague. It was like throwing a ladle of water into a pot of boiling oil, instant explosion. The Euro battle cry, shouted by one and then thousands, drowned out the deafening roar of gunfire and artillery, while most of the young SS soldiers frantically fired their weapons from the trenches, trying to repel the Soviet mechanized infantry and tank assault. The scene was all too familiar to Dietrich, a veteran of World War I, in the freezing winter of December 1914, under conditions that would chill anyone to the bone. Thousands of Tsarist Russian soldiers, virtually identical to the Soviet Red Army troops before them, had charged, bayonets fixed, wave after wave against the German trenches, seemingly impervious to casualties, the same enemy, the same defensive positions, the same iron will, and even the same battle cries as in the Great War. The only difference was that the double-headed eagle banner had been replaced by a flag as red as blood. Clutching his wide-angle periscope, Malyshenko scanned the German position less than 200 meters ahead, seeking out high-priority targets, just as he was about to fire on a German MG-34 machine gun team that had been pouring out continuous fire for over a minute. A screaming projectile cut through the air. An 88mm armor-piercing round followed closely behind. Ding ding. The 88mm round, normally capable of destroying a T-34 tank with a direct hit, met with an unexpected result. The hastily aimed shot, fired in desperation, caused the round, which should have pierced Malyshenko's tank, to strike the outer edge of the turret at a glancing angle and ricochet off. Hey, why are there still surviving 88s? Are these Germans invincible? That the dull thud against his turret armor told Malyshenko that it wasn't some small-caliber pea shooter. Realizing his tank was targeted by an 88, he was about to locate and return fire when a roaring sound, like a flock of eagles, filled the sky above the battlefield.